So our third snippet for this week looks at the 1988 election, which the expectation was that the Democrats were probably in a better position at the start. The lead Democratic candidate was this man, Gary Hart, who was well ahead in the polls. Remember, he had almost defeated Walter Mondale in 1984. But Hart's nomination is derailed by this photograph. There were rumors that Hart had extramarital affairs. It's confirmed when he takes a woman, not his wife, named Donna Rice, on a boat trip in Florida. The boat, wonderfully, is called Monkey Business, and so there's a kind of delicious irony to this. And the incident is attacked as showing Hart's recklessness, that you can't have a president who's having these extramarital affairs. He might be subject to blackmail. What more does it say about Hart's character? And Hart, in the aftermath of this, pulls out of the race. He briefly re-enters later on, but he never becomes a viable candidate again. And it's one of the great what-ifs of American political history that you can wonder what might have happened if Hart had gotten the nomination, which I think he probably would have. He would have had a decent chance of defeating Bush, and subsequent U.S. political history would have been very, very different. So with Hart out, the Democratic race becomes more wide open, but the leading fundraiser in the race becomes the Delaware Democrat Joe Biden, who jumps into the race in 1988. Fresh off his performance in the Bork hearings, he seems to be well regarded by multiple elements of the party as well. But Biden's campaign is likewise undermined by a fairly significant scandal after it comes out that in his speeches he had repeatedly plagiarized other politicians, including most seriously, and we're going to listen to the snippet here, the then leader of the British Labour Party, Neil Kinnock. And the remarkable thing about these elements of plagiarism is that Kinnock's speech, which Biden and his staff plagiarized, is speaking of his own personal experience. And so Biden, in some ways, is incorporating onto his life the life and personal experiences of someone else.
And I started thinking as I was coming over here, why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university?
Why am I the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Why is Glenys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
No, it's not because they weren't as smart. It's not because they didn't work as hard. It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
Does anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent or the strength or the endurance or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
So in the aftermath of this, Biden is forced to withdraw as well. It turns out
and I started
that he
thinking
also plagiarized John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. There were allegations of plagiarism when he was a law student. It looks like his national career at this point is over. There are a couple of Midwestern candidates, Paul Simon and Dick Gephardt, but they both fizzle. And the 1988 Democratic race winds up being a three-person race between these guys. Al Gore, Democratic senator from Tennessee, who runs at this point as a fairly moderate to conservative Democrat. He thinks he's going to be able to win this new Southern primary called Super Tuesday. What Gore doesn't understand is that lots of the moderate and conservative Democrats who might have been willing to vote for him have started to drift out of the Democratic Party as a whole, and his candidacy never really gets off the ground. The second is Jesse Jackson, civil rights leader from Chicago. Remember, we saw him at the '72 convention as the head of the McGovern delegation there. Jackson in 1988, there had been other African Americans who had run for president before. Shirley Chisholm had run. Jackson himself had run in 1984. But Jackson's '88 campaign is the first serious campaign by an African American candidate, and he wins in Michigan, and it looks like maybe he has a chance of winning overall. But ultimately, the nomination goes to the man on the right, Mike Dukakis, the Democratic governor of Massachusetts. but someone who runs on a campaign of centrism and competence. The argument that he makes is that if you elect me, I will run a competent administration. Massachusetts had been doing very well economically in the 1980s. This turns out to be a terrible tactical mistake, but Dukakis sweeps all of these white, all of the yellow states here on the chart. One of the interesting things from this map, take a look at the deep South states from Louisiana over to South Carolina. They all hold their primaries collectively in what's known as Super Tuesday, which is still around. The expectation is that a Southern primary is going to work to the advantage of the more moderate candidate. But what's happened in a lot of these deep Southern states is because so many whites have left the Democratic Party, African Americans are the dominant force in Southern Democratic primaries at this point. So they become the states that Jackson wins. And so when Gore can't sweep the South, he has to drop out. Dukakis and Jackson have a critical battle in Wisconsin, a state with a very liberal Democratic electorate. Jackson was attacking from the left, but when Dukakis wins Wisconsin, that pretty much seals the nomination for him. On the Republican side, Vice President Bush runs, but he finishes third in Iowa, and he seems to be in real problems. Bob Dole, the Senate Republican leader, wins the Iowa caucuses in 1988, and second is the preacher Pat Robertson, an early sign of a pattern that we'll see several times again in this course of evangelical influence in the Iowa Republican caucus. It's a very, very conservative state. The race then goes to New Hampshire, and Bush runs a brutally negative campaign against Dole, attacking Dole in particular on taxes, claiming that Dole, who was a very, very conservative Republican, was actually a surreptitious supporter of taxes. And these ads, even though they're very misleading, work. And they culminate on election night after Bush wins in New Hampshire, on this exchange on national TV. This is NBC National News, where it's supposed to be just sort of a feel-good exchange between Bush, Gore, and the anchor, but it winds up revealing a kind of surly side of Dole's personality.
We're going to do well.
Mr. Vice President, if you look right down at that monitor, you'll see the man that you beat tonight. That's Senator Bob Dole, who is standing by in his headquarters. Anything you'd like to say to him at this point?
No, just wish him well and meet him in the South.
And Senator Dole, is there anything you'd like to say to the Vice President?
Yeah, stop lying about my record.
Well, it sounds like we're setting it up for what's going to happen in Super Tuesday.
Well, that's fine. We're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for coming.
And this Dole line of "stop lying about my record" comes across as him being a sore loser. Bush sweeps the South. He carries all of the states here in yellow on this map. Dole, is only strong in the Midwest, and Bush gets the nomination. There's some pressure for him to pick Dole as his nominee, but he ultimately goes with Dan Quayle, a telegenic conservative senator from Indiana. Dukakis chooses Lloyd Bentsen, a fairly conservative Democratic senator from Texas, and the idea is to recreate the magic of the Kennedy campaign, the Massachusetts presidential nominee and the Texas vice presidential nominee. Bentsen turns out to be a pretty strong candidate, but Dukakis is not. The weakest of the four candidates is Quayle, and there's this famous episode from the 1988 vice presidential debate. Quayle had been attacked for having insufficient experience, and he attempts to deal with that in some of his speeches by comparing himself to John Kennedy. Lloyd Bentsen was prepped on this before the debate and delivers this biting attack.
I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of vice president of this country. I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency. I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Benson?
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
you're the one that was making the comparisons, Senator, and I'm one who knew him well. And frankly, I think you're so far apart in the objectives you choose for your country that I did not think the comparison was well taken.
The sense here is that if Benson had been the Democratic nominee in 1988, he probably would have won, which I suspect was true. What ultimately undoes Dukakis is a very effective line of attack from the Bush people, coordinated by this man, Lee Atwater, a close Bush ally, who was the very smart, very savvy, but vicious campaign manager. He helps put together that ad that we saw, the Willie Horton ad. And also when Dukakis, who had been attacked as being soft on defense, decides to do a tour of a defense plant, a weapons manufacturer, the Atwater people come up with this, find this clip, which leads to what is one of the most effective negative campaign commercials ever in the history of American presidential politics.
Michael Dukakis has opposed virtually every defense system we developed. He opposed new aircraft carriers. He opposed anti-satellite weapons. He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment. Dukakis opposed the stealth bomber and a ground emergency warning system against nuclear attack. He even criticized our rescue mission to Grenada and our strike on Libya. And now he wants to be our commander-in-chief. America can't afford that risk.
And it does sort of communicate the message relatively effectively. The Dukakis campaign fizzles late in the race, and ultimately he only wins very strongly Democratic states, including still West Virginia, a state that's going to switch way over to the Republican Party, but does not do so until after 2000. So the result is that we have Bush elected on largely a negative campaign without too much of a mandate, with a Democratic Congress. The Democrats retain control of both the House and the Senate. And the question is, how is Bush going to, to finesse this as president? And the last 2 snippets that we have for this week, we'll look at that. One final thing from this map, if you look very closely, you'll see in West Virginia, there's a division. There is one of these so-called faithless electors. So that's a Democratic elector who decides not to vote for Dukakis and instead votes for Lloyd Benson as the presidential nominee, which is technically allowed. And this issue of whether faithless electors can be restricted in their votes is before the U.S. Supreme Court this term. There now have been some states that have passed laws. The challenges are to cases in Colorado and Washington State that have passed laws requiring electors to vote for the candidate that the party designates, which seems to go against the constitutional expectation that the Electoral College is nominally at least independent. But one way or another, the Supreme Court will be deciding that issue this term. So next bit, we'll look at Bush's approach to the presidency.